She went to Korea to find her birth mother. She found her, and the woman's son was the man she'd been avoiding for a year. The first thing Adaeze learned about running from someone was that the world was smaller than you thought. She had built the avoidance carefully, methodically, the way she built everything, with precision, with discipline, with the particular kind of pride that Nigerian women inherit from their mothers like a second heartbeat. She had changed her route to the office, declined 3 invitations she would normally have accepted, left a rooftop dinner early in October when she saw his name on the seating arrangement. Her colleague BC had called it dramatic. Adaeze had called it self-preservation. Now she was 9,000 kilometers from Lagos, standing in Incheon Airport with 2 suitcases and a manila folder containing a DNA test result she had not yet allowed herself to fully read, and somehow, Kang Seo-jun was the first face she saw. He was standing at the arrivals barrier with no sign, no driver, just him still, the way still water is still, not peaceful but waiting. For a moment, neither of them moved. And then he said, in that quiet way of his that had always infuriated her, "My mother sent me." And the entire year she'd spent not thinking about him collapsed in on itself, like a building that had never had a real foundation. 12 months earlier, Adaeze Okonkwo had been the kind of woman other women studied without realizing they were studying her. She was 34, senior counsel at a multinational firm with offices in Lagos, London, and Seoul. Her mother had sacrificed a second job for 7 years to pay for her law degree at the University of Lezo, and Adaeze had repaid that sacrifice by becoming the kind of lawyer who made the senior partners nervous, not because she was aggressive, but because she was always 3 moves ahead and never let them see it. She wore her hair natural, cut close at the sides, because she had learned early that hair was a negotiation, and she had stopped negotiating things that were hers. She spoke 3 languages. She prayed every Sunday, not because she was certain, but because her father had. And there were some inheritances you didn't question. Her greatest fear, the one she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even to BC who knew nearly everything, was not failure. It was becoming someone who needed people. Someone who, in needing them, gave them the power to leave. She had watched her mother need her father, watched what happened when he left. Adaeze had decided at 15 that she would be the one who left first, always, emotionally at least. Physically, she stayed everywhere longer than was good for her. In bad jobs, difficult cities, friendships that had turned hollow. But emotionally, she had mastered the early exit, the preemptive distance, the professional warmth that kept people close enough to be useful and far enough to be safe. Then her firm assigned her to the Kang Mercer acquisition. Then she met Seo-jun. Kang Seo-jun had a reputation that arrived before he did, second son of the Kang Group's founding family. Not the heir. That burden fell to his older brother Seo-hyun, who was photographed at charity galas and described in business magazines as visionary. Seo-jun was described, when he was described at all, as the one who actually ran things. He had spent 8 years building the Kang Group's legal risk division, from a department that filed routine compliance paperwork into a team that had restructured 3 acquisitions, avoided 2 international arbitrations, and quietly killed a scandal that would have cost the family everything. He was 37. He had been engaged once briefly to a woman from a family his mother approved of. He had ended it 8 months in, which had cost him considerably in family capital. When people asked why, he said only that it wasn't fair to her. Nobody who knew him well, and very few people knew him well, believed that was the whole answer. He was not cold. That was the misunderstanding people made. He was contained. There was a difference. Cold was the absence of feeling. Containment was the decision to keep it. When Adaeze walked into the first negotiation session for the Kang Mercer acquisition, 7 minutes early, documents already reviewed, a question prepared that nobody else in the room had thought to ask. Seo-jun noticed 3 things in the first 60 seconds. 1, she was not performing competence, she simply had it. 2, she watched exits. Every room she entered, her eyes found the exits first, then the people. It was the habit of someone who had learned to be ready to leave. 3, she was the only person in the room who looked at him. Not the name, not the family, not the role. Just him. The way one person sometimes looks at another and sees the actual shape of them. He did not tell her any of this. He said, "Your reading of the indemnity clause on page 47 is interesting. Walk me through your reasoning." She did. He listened. And something that had been very still in him for a very long time shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way ground shifts before rain. The acquisition took 4 months. 4 months of conference rooms and late revisions, and the specific intimacy of people who are working hard toward the same difficult thing. They develop the kind of relationship that forms between people who are good at what they do and have found, to their mutual surprise, someone else who is good at it differently. He corrected her once, on a matter of Korean corporate law, carefully and without condescension. She thanked him, which surprised him. He'd expected deflection. She corrected him twice, once on a clause that his team had missed, once on a cultural assumption he had made about the Mercer side's negotiating position that was subtly but significantly wrong. He thanked her both times, which surprised her. She'd expected ego. The real thing happened on a Wednesday night in February when the deal nearly collapsed. It was 11:30. The Mercer team had gone back to their hotel after discovering a discrepancy in the subsidiary valuations that threatened to unravel 6 weeks of work. Seo-jun's legal team was exhausted and panicking quietly. Adaeze sat at the conference table long after everyone else had left, working through a solution she could feel was there but hadn't found yet. Seo-jun came back for a document he'd forgotten. He saw her there. He sat down across from her without asking. They worked in silence for 40 minutes. Him on the valuation methodology, her on the contractual framing, and then at 12:17 in the morning, she found it. The mechanism that could hold both sides' interests without either of them having to capitulate. She said, "Here." She turned her laptop so he could see. He read it. He read it again. Then he looked up at her, and for a moment his containment slipped. Just at the edges. And she saw something that looked like relief, and something that looked like wonder, and something else she couldn't name, and quickly stopped trying to. "You've been sitting here alone working on a solution to our problem," he said. "It's my problem too. The Mercer team is not your client." "No. But a failed deal is nobody's win." She closed her laptop. "That's what people miss about negotiation. The goal isn't to defeat the other side. The goal is to build something that doesn't fall apart in 6 months." He was quiet for a moment. "Then where did you learn that? From watching deals that fell apart in 6 months." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. They walked out together at 1 in the morning into a Lagos that never quite slept. The street vendors were still at their corners. Generators hummed behind compound walls. The air smelled of rain coming and the particular urban richness of a city that holds too many people living too fully. "This city," he said, not critically. "I know," she said. "It's a lot. But it's alive in a way that's hard to find. Seoul is also alive currently. I've always wanted to see it." The words had left her mouth before she'd decided to say them. She heard herself say them and felt the small exposure of it, the admission of wanting something, and immediately looked away. He didn't say anything. But he noted it. She could tell. He was the kind of man who noted things. That was the night she began, in careful increments, to be in trouble. What followed was not a romance, or it was, but not the kind that announces itself. It was coffee that lasted 2 hours when it should have lasted 30 minutes. It was him sending her an article about landmark negotiations in emerging markets with a single-line message. "Thought you might find this interesting." It was her finding herself rereading that message 3 times and then refusing to analyze why. It was the night she mentioned, almost in passing, that her mother had been ill. A quiet thing, nothing requiring emergency. And the next day, there was a small package at the office reception. Inside, a tin of Korean red ginseng tea. No note. She knew it was from him because no one else would have known to send something rather than say something. She put the tea on her desk and did not drink it for 4 days because drinking it felt like an acknowledgement she wasn't ready to make. He, for his part, was navigating something he had no map for. He had been lonely for a long time. Not the acute loneliness of sudden isolation, but the chronic kind. The loneliness of a man who has many obligations and very few people who ask how he actually is, his mother asked. His mother was the only one. Everyone else in his life wanted something from the role he occupied. Even people who genuinely liked him, liked the version of him that came with the power and the surname. Adaeze didn't want anything from the role. She engaged with him, challenged him, disagreed with him, listened to him. As though the surname were incidental. as though she were simply interested in the person underneath it. He hadn't experienced that in years. He wasn't sure he knew what to do with it. The acquisition closed on a Thursday. The team had dinner, a celebration, noisy and generous. Seo-jun sat at the end of the table and watched Adaeze across the room, laughing at something BC had said, her head thrown back, all her professional composure briefly abandoned, and he understood with a clarity that surprised him that he was going to miss her. He didn't say this. He raised his glass when she caught his eye across the room, and she raised hers, and something was communicated that neither of them had language for yet. Then his brother Seo-jun arrived at the dinner, unannounced, as was his way. Theatrical entrances were one of the privileges he'd claimed as the heir. He was charming and loud, and immediately the center of everything, and he saw Adaeze and made his way to her with the confidence of a man who had never once considered rejection. Seo-jun watched his brother sit down beside her, watched him lean in, watched Adaeze smile, politely. He could tell the difference. He had studied her face without meaning to, and then make a graceful exit to the bar. He should have gone to her then. He didn't. Because going to her would have meant declaring something he hadn't yet examined the full weight of, and Seo-jun did not do things he hadn't examined. This was his first mistake. He would spend a year understanding it. 2 weeks after the deal closed, Adaeze's world rearranged itself. Her aunt in Enugu, her mother's older sister, the family historian, the keeper of photographs and stories, called on a Sunday morning. Adaeze had been making tea. She remembered this clearly afterwards. The kettle mid-boil, steam rising, everything ordinary. "There is something," her aunt said. "Something I should have told your mother. Something your mother should have told you. But she was afraid, and then she was ill, and now I am old, and I will not carry this to my grave." This followed was this. Adaeze's mother, Ngozi, had come to Lagos at 22 with nothing. She'd worked for 4 years in a hospital laundry. During that time, she'd become close to a Korean doctor, a woman named Kang Mi-rae, a pediatric surgeon, doing a 2-year volunteer residency. They were the kind of friends that cross every obvious boundary of culture and class, bonded by the specific intimacy of 2 women who are both far from home and brave enough to admit it. When Mi-rae returned to Seoul, she was pregnant, unmarried, from a family where this was a particular kind of catastrophe. She'd asked Ngozi, her only confidant, her closest friend, whether she could leave the baby, just until she found a way to manage her family, just temporarily. Ngozi, who had also just found out she could not carry a pregnancy to term, said yes. Temporarily became 3 years. And then Mi-rae's family found out, and the shame machinery began, and the communication broke down. Not with malice, her aunt said, but with the terrible inertia of people choosing survival. And Ngozi, who had already loved the baby as her own for 3 years, simply kept loving her. The baby was Adaeze. The tea kettle screamed. Adaeze didn't move to turn it off for all time. She did not tell anyone for 2 months. She commissioned a DNA test in silence. She received results that confirmed what her aunt had said, and she sat with them in silence. She called her mother in hospital and had a conversation about nothing in particular and said, "I love you, Mama," at the end, which she always said and meant perhaps more than usual. And then she began, quietly and methodically, to research Kang Mi-rae. What she found. Kang Mi-rae is now 61, chief of pediatric surgery at Yonsei University Hospital in Seoul. A woman who had married at 35, a man who knew her history and loved her anyway, a woman who had 2 sons, one named Seo-hun, one named Seo-jun. A woman who, according to 3 separate interviews Adaeze found in Korean medical journals, described her greatest regret as, "a debt of love I have no way to repay." Adaeze read that last line on a Tuesday evening in her Lagos apartment. She read it 4 times, then she closed her laptop and sat very still and understood that she was going to have to go to Seoul. And then, almost immediately, she understood the other thing. That going to Seoul meant Kang Seo-jun, the man she had spent 11 months not thinking about. The man she had kept at a careful distance because the alternative, the vulnerable, terrifying alternative, was to admit that for the first time in her adult life, she had set someone she could not easily place in a category. Not professional contact, not brief connection, something else. Something that didn't have a safe name. She had chosen the distance. He had not stopped her. She had read that as confirmation. As he felt nothing, or nothing significant. As the safest interpretation. She had not considered that he might have read her distant as a door closing. That a man who had learned, through years of being wanted for the wrong reasons, to wait for permission before stepping forward. That such a man would not step through a door that appeared to be closing. Neither of them had spoken the right language. And now she was standing in Incheon Airport looking at him, and the year between them felt like a country she'd been living in alone. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at Seoul arriving, the Han River, enormous and gray and carrying the sky on its surface. The mountains in the distance, older than everything else in view. He said, "She's been preparing for this for 2 weeks. Since she called you. She called me 3 days ago. She's known you might come for longer than that. She's been trying to find a way to contact you for years. She hired someone. I didn't know. She never told me." A pause. "She didn't want to put pressure on me in case I knew you professionally." Adaeze turned to look at him. "Did you know? Before she told you I was coming?" He was quiet for 3 beats. "No." And now? His jaw tightened. Not anger, something else. "Now I'm thinking about a lot of things." She understood. She was his mother's daughter. That made her. The woman he'd spent a year not forgetting. Something else now. Something complicated in ways that Korean family structure had very specific feelings about. Something that required navigation. She looked back out the window. The city was everything he had promised it would be. That night in Lagos, when neither of them had been quite honest. Alive differently. More organized in its aliveness. More architectural. But underneath the glass and the neon, there was history everywhere. Temple rooftops, the ghost of walls, the particular stubbornness of a city that had been broken and rebuilt so many times it had stopped being afraid of either. She felt something unexpected. Recognition. Kang Mirae was smaller than Adaeze had imagined her. She was waiting at the door of a house in Seoul that smelled of doenjang jjigae and something sweet Adaeze couldn't identify. She was a small, straight-spined woman with Seo-jun's eyes, or rather, he had hers, and when she saw Adaeze, she made a sound that wasn't a word, just a sound. The sound of 32 years of a particular kind of grief arriving. Finally, at its end, they sat in her kitchen. Mirae had prepared japchae and galbijim and 3 side dishes with the thoroughness of someone who needed their hands occupied. Adaeze ate carefully, conscious of receiving something enormous. Seo-jun ate too, and said very little, and watched his mother in a way Adaeze understood. He was seeing her differently. The story had rearranged something in the way he understood her. Mirae talked. She talked for 2 hours, the night she left the hospital in Lagos, the flight back to Seoul, the family's response, which was not gentle, the way she'd tried to find Ngozi 3 years later, and found that the number had changed, and the neighborhood had changed, and it was the 90s, and the world was not connected the way it became later. How she'd carried the grief of it for 3 decades, not as guilt alone but as a kind of ongoing love, sending it outward into the world, hoping somehow it reached her daughter. "I became a pediatric surgeon," Mirae said, "not only because of you, but also because of you." Adaeze had been holding herself very carefully the whole time. Professional composure. The internal scaffolding that had held her together through every hard thing she had ever walked through. It was those words that undid it. Not dramatically, quietly, the way a well-built thing can hold through a storm, and then, when the storm passes, simply release, she cried without sound. The way Nigerians cry when they are trying to be strong, all the feeling with none of the exhibition. Mirae moved around the table and held her, and she was exactly the right height for it, and smelled of something familiar Adaeze would later identify as shea butter, a small, impossible thread running through the decades. Seo-jun sat across the table and looked at the space between his hands and understood that he was witnessing something sacred. He did not look away. Looking away would have been a kind of abandonment. Later, much later, when Mirae had gone to rest and the kitchen was quiet and the city outside was doing its nighttime things, Seo-jun made tea, Korean barley tea, roasted and warm and slightly earthy. He put the cup in front of her and sat across from her, and for a while, they simply existed in the same space without either of them needing to fill it. Then he said, "You knew before you called her. You knew who she was to you, and then you had to decide whether to pursue it." "Yes, and you came anyway. She had a debt of love she had no way to repay." Her words in an interview from 2019. I read it and I thought, what must it be like to carry that for 30 years? Adaeze looked at her cup. And I thought, what kind of person would I be if I let her keep carrying it? Seo-jun said nothing for a moment. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked up. At the dinner. After the acquisition closed, I watched you. I watched you leave the table when Seo-hyun came over and I didn't follow. I told myself it wasn't the right moment. I told myself I needed to be sure first. He met her eyes. I was afraid, and I dressed it up as patience and called it consideration, but it was fear. You were already starting to leave. Not the room, you were leaving the space between us. And I watched it happen, and I let it happen. Adaeze felt her chest constrict. I was leaving because I thought you didn't. I know what you thought. You thought I felt nothing, because I didn't say anything, because I am very good at not saying things. A pause. It's something my father passed to me, the belief that restraint is always dignity, that holding your feelings is strength. I am realizing it is sometimes just a way of making other people bear the cost of your silence. She stared at him. She had not expected this. She had expected his composure, his contained professionalism, the Seo-jun she had built a careful image of over a year of deliberate distance. Not this. Not honesty delivered this quietly, this precisely, like a thing he had been holding for a long time and had decided to finally set down. I also have to say something, she said slowly. I left because I was afraid, not of you specifically, of needing you, of discovering I needed you and then having that taken away. It's a habit, a very old one. I am working on it, so we were both protecting ourselves, from each other, while missing each other. A long silence. That is very human of us, Adaeze said finally, and very stupid. He almost smiled, then actually smiled. It was the same smile she remembered from Lagos, rare, unhurried, like something that had been decided rather than reflexed. Yes, he said. Very. What followed was not simple. The Kang family had opinions about everything. Seo-hyun, who had the social intelligence of a man who had always been given what he wanted, was confused in a way that expressed itself as mild hostility. Mirai's husband, a gentle, formal man named Jae-won, was kind to Adaeze in the careful way of someone who has processed a complex thing and arrived at acceptance through effort rather than ease. And then there was the question of what exactly Adaeze and Seo-jun were. Not siblings, they shared no blood, and the relationship between their parents was not the kind that created legal family bonds. But the emotional geometry of it was complicated. The woman who had given birth to Adaeze was the woman who had raised Seo-jun. That meant something. What exactly it meant was going to require time and conversation and the willingness to sit with uncertainty. Adaeze stayed in Seoul for 10 days. She spent her mornings with Mireille, learning her habits, learning what she'd missed, building tentative brickwork towards something that didn't have a name yet, but felt like it was being built in the right direction. She video called her mother in Lagos every evening. Her mother, who had known this day might come and had been frightened of it for 30 years, cried every call. Adaeze cried too, sometimes. They said I love you every time, which was always true, and never the whole story. She spent her afternoons learning Seoul. Seo-jun was her guide in the way of someone who has grown up inside something and rediscovers it through someone else's eyes. He took her to Bukchon Hanok village and watched her touch the old walls, to a small naengmyeon restaurant in Mapo-gu where he ate as a child, to the Han River at dusk where they sat on the bank and watched the city perform its evening ritual of light. In those afternoons, they talked the way people talk when they have stopped being careful. He told her about his father, who had died when Seo-jun was 29, and the inheritance that wasn't only money. It was expectation, it was standard, it was a particular understanding of what a Kang man was and was not. He loved me, Seo-jun said, but he loved the version of me that was useful to the family. I don't know if he ever met the other version. She told him about her mother, the real story now, the sacrifice, the secret, the love that had been fierce and genuine, and also built on a foundation that was never properly disclosed. She is still my mother, Adaeze said. That part is not complicated for me. What's complicated is the silence. The years of not being trusted with my own story. That's what parents do, Seo-jun said quietly. They protect you from truths they think will hurt you, without asking whether the protection is worse. And then we do the same thing to the people we love. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the river. We withhold, we protect ourselves and call it protecting them. We say nothing because saying something requires us to be seen. A long silence. the kind that held weight. "I see you," he said, just that simply. "I have since Lagos. I should have said so then." She turned to look at him. The light was gold and complicated, and the Han River was enormous behind him, and she thought, "There is nothing safe about this man. He is going to require me to be known. He is going to require honesty and time, and the willingness to stay when staying is hard." She also thought, "I have been afraid of exactly this for 15 years, and I am 34 years old, and the fear has cost me enough." "I know," she said. "I saw you too. Act 5, what remains the complications did not disappear." Seo-jun made a comment at a family dinner, something dressed as a joke that wasn't, about what it meant for the family image. Seo-jun replied in a tone Adaeze hadn't heard from him before, quiet, final, the voice of a man who had decided something and was done renegotiating it. She didn't understand the Korean well enough to follow the whole exchange, but she understood his tone, and she understood from the silence that followed that it had landed. Later, she asked him what he'd said. "I told him that the family had already decided who we were through our mother's choices 30 years ago. She chose love when it was costly. I intend to as well." Adaeze was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot to put on something that's still very new." "Yes, but new things grow, or they don't. I would rather make room for growth than protect myself from the possibility of it." She thought about this for the rest of that evening. About growth. About room. About the architecture of what it took to build something real between two people. Not the romantic mythology of it, but the actual bricklaying. The choosing, every day, to remain open when closing was easier. There was also the question of geography. She was based in Lagos, he was based in Seoul. Their professional lives were demanding and real. Neither of them was naive about distance. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple," she told him on her last evening in Seoul. They were in his apartment, clean lines, good light, books in Korean and English, and one shelf of architecture that she had studied carefully while he made dinner. "It isn't simple. It's 2 countries and 2 careers and a family situation that doesn't have a template." "No," he agreed. He set food in front of her. Doenjang jjigae he'd learned from his mother, a recipe that had apparently taken him 3 attempts this week to get right, which he had not mentioned until she asked why there were 3 different pots drying on the rack. She smiled at that, at the image of him in this precise apartment, trying and failing and trying again. For her, without saying so. "What I know," he said sitting across from her, "is that the last year, the year I spent not acting, I won't do that again. I don't want the next version of regret to be this one, having been near you and not said clearly, 'This matters to me. You matter to me.'" She ate a spoonful of the jjigae. It was good. He had gotten it right. "You matter to me too," she said. "I am still afraid. I want to be transparent about that. But I think afraid and willing can exist at the same time. I think that's where most of the real things start." She flew back to Lagos on a Sunday morning. Myre came to the airport. She held both of Adaeze's hands in both of hers and said, in the deliberate English she had been practicing since she made the call 3 weeks ago, "I cannot undo the years, but I am here now, and I intend to stay here." "I know," Adaeze said. "So do I." Seo-jun was there too. He stood to the side, giving his mother her moment, and when Myre stepped back, he walked forward and did something she hadn't expected. He embraced her, properly. The way people embrace when they are not performing warmth but actually feeling it. She let herself be held. That was the bravest thing she did that day. "I'll come to Lagos in 6 weeks," he said against her hair. "You'll need malaria prophylaxis. I've already looked it up." Of course he had. She felt something that was the opposite of the tightness she'd lived with for a year. Something loosening, something wide, something that felt suspiciously like peace. On the flight home, somewhere over the Sahara, Adaeze opened her notebook, the leather-bound one she used for case notes, the serious one, and wrote, not a legal argument, not a strategy memo. Just, what I know now that I didn't know a year ago. She wrote, that silence is not strength, that distance is not dignity. That protection, when it is only protecting yourself, is just fear wearing better clothes. She wrote, that identity is not a single root but a whole root system. That having 2 mothers doesn't have the love, it doubles the inheritance. That the woman who raised you and the woman who bore you can both be real, both be necessary, both be complicated, and none of that cancels any of the rest. She wrote, that the man I kept at a careful distance for a year was keeping the same careful distance, and we were each standing on our side of an empty room we had both built, wondering why it felt so cold. She wrote, "I am going to need courage for this. Not the courage I already have, the kind I use in courtrooms, the professional kind, the other kind. The domestic, daily, ordinary courage of letting someone stay close, even when part of you is convinced they will eventually leave." Then she closed the notebook. Below her, the desert was enormous and ancient, and completely indifferent to her decisions, which was somehow comforting. The world was old. She was new in it. She had time. She thought about Kang Myrae, sending love outward for 30 years and trusting it would reach someone. She thought about her mother, Ngozi, holding a baby she had not been given permission to love and loving her anyway. Fiercely, imperfectly, completely. She thought about Seo-jun in his apartment at midnight, alone in the kind of quiet that comes from being competent and respected and known by almost no one, learning a recipe he would not mention unless asked. She thought, we are all just people trying to give and receive love without the damage we're carrying getting in the way. Sometimes the damage wins, sometimes you arrive too late. Sometimes the timing is wrong and the cost is high and the geography is impossible and the pride is too thick and the silence is too loud. And sometimes you climb into the wrong airport car and end up somewhere true. And sometimes a woman 30 years ago makes a desperate, human, imperfect choice and sets in motion a story that ends, not without scars, not without complication, but genuinely, with two people finding their way to each other through everything that tried to keep them apart. Adaeze put her seat back, closed her eyes. Somewhere behind her, a baby was crying and someone was laughing and a flight attendant was explaining something in 3 languages about a descent that was still hours away. She slept. For the first time in a year, she slept without the vague unease of something unfinished. The world moved beneath her. The story, in the way all real stories do, continued. End.